No, I'll be giving a SAML training. This one was actually given to sales engineers last month when they all came out to Santa Clara. And so I'm also, based on that success, I'm also giving you guys one. But it's better this time because we actually had scheduled 3 hours. This one was done in 2 hours, but, so this time we have 3 hours, 1 hour for 3 weeks. So we'll actually get to cover more troubleshooting materials as well. So the plan as of now is for today, I will just go over what is SAML, how it works, how the redirection and the information has to be exchanged between service provider and identity provider, which Centrify is an identity provider. And then next week, we are going to do some hands-on lab exercise. Some of you have already done it, I've heard, but we'll still go over that. And then we'll then be talking about troubleshooting and tools and any other thing. Okay, so this one today is going to be a little dry, more lecture style. We put a lot of materials in the slide just so in the future, if you need some future reference, you could come back and read this. In fact, all these information are from the internet. We didn't write this ourselves, so you could always just go onto the internet and look for even more information. Okay, so I'll be going kind of fast, I think. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll try to answer it right away. Okay, so what is SAML? We keep saying SAML, S-A-M-L. It stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. It is a standard for an identity provider and service provider to exchange XML messages, which I'll show you what XML is earlier if any of you are not familiar with it. And at a high level, this picture is, it's as simple as this, just two-party exchanging secret message, if you will. Of course, how the secret message is constructed, that is the setup part, right? Which we'll get to. So here's the workflow. Now we have a service provider, which is the A here at the bottom left, and then Centrify as an identity provider. And now we have the new term Centrify Identity Service, that's us, and the browser interface, which is the user himself or herself. So what will happen is when the user wants to access the target application, like Salesforce or Box, anything, then now because SAML has been set up between service provider and an identity provider, so the service provider will know that, hey, I'm not supposed to authenticate you anymore. You need to go to identity provider. So I will redirect you to Centrify. And then Centrify will, then this is where the user portal login screen kicks in. The user enters the Centrify username and password. Then the background, Centrify validates this user via AD or whatever, right? Cloud connector, that's the umbrella term here. And once that succeeds, then Centrify will redirect the user back to the application with the message containing the identity as well as other information. When the service provider receives this message and know this guy, signature is validated, this guy is cleared and he's logged in to the application. So here's an example. One example. So I'm going to use Kibble as an example. We use Kibble every day, I suppose, right? Mm-hmm. And you guys use Salesforce way more than I do. So now one way to use Salesforce actually, we could actually go to Centrify's account in Salesforce via this URL, centrify.my.salesforce.com. And because SAML single sign-on has been set up, Salesforce will direct us back to Kibble, right? And if we're in the company network, we have IWA, so we might not even get to enter username and password. But this workflow has taken place, right? As well as this one. Otherwise, we enter our username and password, and Centrify will actually redirect us back to Salesforce, and we are logged in. So all of this, once it's in place, it happens so fast that, right, we normally don't even see it. But, well, in practice, how many of you actually go to Salesforce by going to that URL? I don't. We click on the tile in Kibble, right? Yeah. So that's another flavor, and then some of you guys already know the term. But I'll say that later, so bear with me right now. So what we do in practice is really, we go to Kibble first. We log in via IWA or not, right? And then we click on the Salesforce tile, and then it will log us into Salesforce. So if you look at the arrows, comparing this diagram with the previous one, the workflow is almost like cut in half, right? And what they are is really just, what I call two flavors of SAML single sign-on. One is SASP initiated, one is IDP initiated. And this really is just English. This is not so much a technical term. What it really means is when we click on Kibble tile, we are initiating the single sign-on from IDP, right? That's what IDP initiated single sign-on means. The first example, I go to Salesforce first, to that URL. So the single sign-on is initiated from the service provider side, which is in this example, Salesforce. Okay, so far so good? Okay, moving on. So now, so always keep this diagram in mind, right? Basically three things here: the user, the service provider, and the IDP. Now, let's talk about the actual message being sent, right? When there's redirection happening, there's some message being passed back and forth. What are they? Now, the most important one is actually called SAML response. And for you guys who have seen Network Trace, that's exactly what you see, SAML response. And there's a more casual term, we call it SAML token. SAML response is usually what we refer to. Of course, and later on, we'll also talk about SAML request, which is another kind of message. But anyway, for SAML response, it's also known as SAML assertion. So this is some interchangeable terms here. And it is a package of information that supplies one or more statements made by SAML authority. So that contains the authentication information. The most important part here is the name ID, as well as some other information like name ID format, you guys have seen. Attributes. Some service providers use attributes. Many others do not. And SAML is also capable of other things like authorization decisions, other things that we actually usually do not use. And here's just another term. Federation server is just a server that's handling entity between SP and IDP. And yeah, we'll get to these terms again later on. Okay. So this one, I want to show you what the SAML response look like. Right? It could be as long as this, sometimes even longer. This is an XML message. What XML is pretty much is just, it's a specific format that whenever you open up a tag, like with any name, you got to close it. And then in between, that's your value you want to put inside that XML element. That's pretty much it. I mean, that's the most simple definition of XML I can give you. But then this response is generated by Centrify Cloud, and we don't actually have to look at most of them. So here I highlighted some of the important pieces that we looked at in red. So this response just means that this message is a response. This destination means the ACS URL where this message is supposed to be going to. And then the assertion piece is the elements that contains the actual identity piece, which if some of you guys keep hearing me saying name ID, this is what I mean, right? The identity of the user is inside this element. And then issuer is and an entity ID that identifies Centrify and the service provider. And this little diagram here just shows you how, these elements are nested in another. Yes?
I see this actual visual where we do the test on the insertion.
Yeah.
So you said Centrify, is this what we're testing? Is this what this entire SAML response, are we sending, is this an example of what we're sending to the service provider, or before we get to the service provider, sort of like a preview kind of?
With the test button?
Yeah.
That's just pretty much a preview.
To what we're going to send to the service provider,
Yes.
right? Okay. Just want to make sure.
Okay. Now, along with SAML response, there's another thing called relay state. It is a value that is given by the service provider, and is only used, in most cases, only used during SP initiative single sign-on. So what it is, it's just a piece of information that service provider will give to IDP Centrify, but Centrify is only to return it back to them. So Centrify is not supposed to change it. It's just a piece of information that they want you to give them back. That's why it's called relay state. It's a relay.
Any examples in what situations? Like I see there is a landing page definition. Is there like a use case where you see this happening?
Yes, most of many service providers actually use a relay state to define the landing page. So that's one of the example usage I list here. If you see the network trace, the relay state coming out is a URL that will define after the user is authenticated via Centrify, when the user is redirected back in the application where they are supposed to land. Which means, yeah, in some cases, then technically speaking, even though we're not supposed to do that, but then in some cases we have to do that, is we could actually modify this relay state as a landing URL to control where this user could land. So that's a rare use case, but that could happen. Now, some other service provider, if you look at the relay state, if they use it, it looks like an encoded string. Like we don't know what it is. But then if we don't send it back to the service provider, right, they will actually know that, hey, you're not the one that I redirect you to. So in those cases, the relay state, that kind of relay state value is used as some, additional security measure to make sure that, I'm sending you to Centrify with this ticket or bug or whatever, right? And when this guy comes back, it has to also come with this same value.
Okay, got it. Thank
So we have there's a constant value for the relay state, right? That identifies us as Centrify. For the service, meaning it doesn't change. It's the same one per, I guess, SAML response. Because I'm sure you're saying that it's something that we're going to send to the service provider that they're going to identify us with, right?
I think it depends on the service provider because it's the service provider that's issuing that.
Oh, that's what the service provider provides.
Ultimately, it does.
Okay.
When you, what I just talked about, when they give like an encoded string, when they do use it that way, most of the time this is actually a dynamic value.
Oh, okay.
That even they dynamically generate.
Oh, okay, got it.
But then, of course, when they use it for landing page, then it's most of the time it's going to be the same.
So when a relay state is needed, is that a special entry in the advanced section for our SAML?
Yes, and you are advanced too. Yes, yes, there is. I intend to cover that part like way later.
Okay.
But yes, there is a method in advanced scripts that if service provider must have a relay state, then we actually have the capability to set one. So even though there's none coming in, we could still set one and send it back. But those are very rare use cases because, right, by definition, they are supposed to send us one, rather than tell us what to set.
In catalog, do we already know the customers, the applications that require that?
Cloud.
The applications we have in catalog, is it already identified which one requires relay state?
No.
No? Okay, we'll have to learn to get it.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, relay state is not part of the SAML response.
Oh, it's not. Oh,
It's not.
okay.
It's a query parameter. So if you look at, and we will get to that, when you look at a network trace, it is one of the parameter that goes along with the IDP login URL, which is generated by our SAML application.
Oh, okay.
But it's not inside the SAML response.
Oh, okay. When I saw the additional security token, that's why I was a little confused. Okay, I got it. No.
Okay, so now let's move on to SAML request. So SAML, we've looked at SAML response. SAML response is sent by an IDP to SP. Start using acronyms now. IDP stands for Identity Provider, SP stands for Service Provider. SAML request is like the other way. It is sent from SP to IDP during SP initial single sign-on. So here's an example. It is much shorter than a SAML response. It could be longer, but it's usually not as long. The root element that indicates this is a SAML request is actually auth request. And then this destination means where this SAML request is supposed to go to. And then this issuer value here identifies the service provider. So sometimes there's some interesting values here that we will take a look at the SAML request to see, if the values match our configuration or not. Okay, so back to the SAML diagram again. Now we are able to add more, a little detail here, right? Now this is a SP initiated single sign-on workflow. So once again, the user in the browser goes to service provider. Now service provider will send IDP a SAML request, right? And if they use a relay state, they will send it along with it. Now remember, relay state is actually optional. So some service provider doesn't even use it. So that will get passed to Centrify. Centrify will validate the user and send back the SAML response with the identity, right? And passing back the same relay state. And then service provider get them and lock the user in. Okay, so far so good? All right, so I've shown you the workflow, and the message is being sent back and forth. But the important part of all of this is, right, how to set it up. Because I just showed you about the end result. Okay, well, once everything is set up, this is great. But the difficult part is really how to set it up. So another way to saying this is how to establish a trust between an SP and an IDP. And some of you guys have done it already now. With a SAML applications, every SAML application has some information that we Centrify are supposed to give it to the SP side to configure. In some cases, when the service provider actually have an admin interface to enter that information, then we get to do it too. Now I keep saying we, but with you guys support, our customer have their cloud admin, which assumingly have access to both sides, right? Their Centrify cloud tenant as well as the service provider side. Otherwise, have a contact to the service provider. We want to change SAML settings. So, right, here's the information generated by Centrify Cloud. Please configure it. So that's and then service provider from the service provider side. Most of the time, there's also information that Centrify needs from them, right? So that's what it means by the exchange. And with issue of value, that's how we identify each other. The destination, so that's the destination value you saw in SAML request and the response. And then there's also this sign-in certificate that IDP, the Centrify will give to SP, because that certificate will be used to verify the signature, which is really the heart of the this like how it is being secure is because of the certificate. So just think about it as right, two parties wants to send mails to each other. So I need to know like who's the recipient, right? What name I put on the envelope and what address. And then in addition, if there's any SAML attributes to be used, service provider is supposed to provide that information, telling us what attribute names to enter and what values they're expecting. Okay. And then to actually test it to work, we preferably, they could provide a test account and test user. So in my experience with, some SAML integrations were actually initiated by a customer that we never have a contact on that side, but a customer needs it, right? And they don't see that application in that catalog. That's why they call you guys, right? So in that case, and if we don't have the luxury to get an additional test account for Centrify, then we'll just use their account to integrate, right? And by using generic SAML application. Okay, so now let's get into the pieces. What pieces of information that needs to be exchanged? The first one is entity ID. So what I just said about, when I want to send you a letter, right, I need to know whom to send it to, and then in the return address, if you will, like who am I, right? That kind of thing. So in SAML, it is called an entity ID. It has another name called issuer. Now, issuer is actually the name that you see in generic SAML application, as well as inside the SAML response and the SAML request. But then, yeah, it really does have another name called entity ID. So if you see entity ID, now you know it means issuer. If you see issuer, it also means entity ID. And this applies to both IDP and SP. So at any time, if someone just say, hey, here's an issuer value, we actually have to clarify, do you mean IDP issuer or SP issuer? Okay.
There's two.
Yes.
Okay.
So by specifications, that's what they are. Now, but I'll tell you that there have been two very special cases, and NetScaler being one of the two. They actually only house one entity ID. Then in that case, well, it doesn't. See, the bottom line here is that value has to match on both sides. So in a special case where the service provider only used one issuer value, then you could actually just choose either one, as long as they match. That doesn't happen often, but it could happen. Okay, now when it comes to an SP entity ID or SP issuer, it is given a special name called audience. Sorry, I clicked on it. Now I have to point this out because inside SAML response, you will see a value called audience. And in fact, in advanced script, for those of you who have seen it, there's actually a method called set audience. This is it. This is SP entity ID. And the value of this is supposed to come from service provider, right? They will tell you what entity ID you use, and that's where we enter. Now, for IDP entity ID, when we use generic SAML application, right, the default we always see is https://cloud.centrify.com/SAML/generic SAML. What we actually expect people to do is to change the generic SAML to like an actual application name, such as Salesforce. But here what I want to talk about is the format of it. We actually, and I'll be honest with you, this definition have grown. When generic SAML template was first made, not as much thought has been put to that. But nowadays we have, and you two know more, I believe, that some service providers require an IDP entity ID to be unique, right? So even if we just change the generic SAML to Salesforce, That's still not unique enough. That's exactly what happened to version 1 and I think Smartsheet. So the new scheme, the latest scheme as of now to make it unique or more closer to unique, is we'll actually also add the tenant ID and then the count of the same SAML application. So what it means is and now we are designing the scheme just to, hopefully in the long run it will, solve every case, right? But will it actually happen? We don't know. What I'm saying is, if given, sorry, I clicked on it again. Given one cloud tenant, right, LG602, for whatever reason, it will have two Salesforce SAML applications, right? Then the identity ID has to be, if we want it to be unique, then we need some, differentiation, right? That's why the count comes in, right? So from now on, when we use a generic SAML application, please just go ahead and set the IDP entity ID to, using this format.
So if we do the generic SAML app and kind of build it for a non-catalog, we should do this.
Yes. Mm-hmm. It is not likely we will have the second SAML application of the same in the same tenant. I don't think so, but when that happens, we increment this count.
Maybe like a Salesforce sandbox, Salesforce production. Yes.
Okay.
So once again, we come up with a scheme to make it unique, or once again closer to unique by adding the tenant ID. So to separate this tenant from that tenant, this customer from that customer. And then within the same tenant, the count, they treat it like a number ID of the SAML application. Okay, destinations. Now we'll talk about that. We've seen it. So when the SP sends IDP a SAML request, where does it send it to? Now in generic SAML application, you will see there's a field called identity provider single sign-on URL. There's another name called IDP login URL. But by definition, right, just what it means is where SP is supposed to redirect a user to. Right, that is equivalent to saying where the SAML request is going to, because that's the same, right? That's the same flow.
Yeah, just run that. That should be the the user portal, right? For us, when it's the IDP initiated. Because I had a question on what's the IDP login URL? I just popped up enterprise.com/command.
Yes, and then with this URL, you will see additional information such as the app key and the customer ID. So what that app key means is, well, that is the app key of that specific tile that you guys have configured. Yes?
Can that single sign-on URL include both cloud and a tenant-specific URL?
Cloud and specific.
So can we use the generic cloud.centrify.com versus lg602.my.centrify.com/my? Are they interchangeable? Tenant URL.
Oh, you mean that part?
Yes. The login.
I would think they would be interchangeable,
it's just whatever
right?
you specify as the login.
But like our mobile currently is not for cloud, so I just want to make sure that with this it is.
Yes, it is. In fact, this IDP URL right now, this URL is not a real URL. It's really just a string.
Right. I'm just saying that, for example, in this case, it would be kibble. It would be a corp-my.kibble.centrify.com/my. That would be okay.
That would be okay.
Okay,
yeah.
perfect.
So yeah, this IDP entity ID has nothing to do with the actual Podscape end.
As a best practice for customers, do you have a preference on using cloud or the specific tenant URL? I'm assuming the tenant URL would be the most direct app pathway for them.
That's the new way, right?
Right.
Not here, when we go back to the IDP sign-on page,
UDP.
there, the first bullet. IDP single sign-on URL.
For that one, it's just whatever generated by
Whatever link is going to take them to their
the SAML application. In fact, I noticed that a SAML application nowadays will give you the tenant URL,
Okay.
not just a cloud.
Okay. So as a best practice, we would likely want customers to start with that tenant URL as opposed to the generic cloud, if that's what I'm understanding.
For the issuer, you're saying. I'm thinking. You can't go wrong with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to break it, and certainly would help with any cookie caching and like that on the browser. I'm just thinking as a general best practice, does that make sense to?
It does.
Okay, perfect.
If you ask me, I think it does.
Okay. Guys, if we find out anything other than that, to the contrary, let's make a note of it, but that seems like a plausible.
Okay.
Awesome.
And ultimately, the same value on the SP side just has to match.
Yeah, but when you download the metadata, I don't think it always says about.enterprise.com. I think it says your tenant ID, whatever that you specify in metadata. I'll take it again.
I mean, either one in theory should work, right? But one's going to redirect versus one is not. So I'm just thinking as a best practice, we'd want to avoid the redirect. That's all. Cool.
Okay, for another kind of destination, this is very important. When Centrify sends, redirects the user back to service provider with a sample response, that URL, and you will see this URL input field in a generic SAML application. That is called ACS URL. I always say that. What it stands for, Assertion Consumer Service URL. You will also see that in metadata, SP metadata, you will see that, or even in some SAML requests, you will see that Assertion Consumer Service URL. Why I'm stressing that so much is because this address where we are supposed to send a SAML response to is different from the login page URL that like user would enter username and password. Now, if they turn out to be the same URL, that is a coincidence. By definition, it is a different thing. And this URL is once again given by service provider. It's not something like we are even like we can guess. Of course, when we are desperate, we can guess, but by definition, this is not the same as the login page URL. So if we don't have this, we will have to ask service provider, and they will either give us that, or if they give us a SP metadata, which I'll talk about that later on, that will be inside the metadata also. Now, all these terms I've been saying, on the SP side, they could use different names. So when you're not sure, just make sure that what they mean is what you know. You need to know what they're asking for. For example, some service provider use the name SAML postback URL. If you, I wasn't sure what it is, so I just asked, well, is that the same as the URL that you want us to send you the SAML response? Well, the answer was yes. So that means what they mean by SAML postback URL is really the ACS URL. Now, ACS URL also has sometimes there's another name called ACS endpoint, which is also a URL, but it's just a different name once again.
So why is there so much inconsistency with the naming? Is there different versions where it changed, like MO1 versus 2 had different, or is it just kind of a loose naming at this point?
If you ask me, I think it's a loose
okay.
convention at this point. Because if you look at the words, it actually does say what they want to say. SAML postback URL. Well, we are posting back a SAML response to that URL. So by definition, that is ACS URL. But they have chosen to name it differently.
Okay.
Okay, next thing I'm going to talk about is bindings. Some service provider will ask us if they want us to, if they want Centrify to, I'm still saying that wrong. When they send a SAML request to Centrify, should it be via post or GET? Now, formally, what that means is there are different bindings: HTTP post and HTTP redirect. For service provider to send SAML requests to Centrify, we actually support both. So they could use, well, when I say both, it's HTTP post or HTTP redirect. But when Centrify sends a SAML response to ACS URL, we only do post. Now back to the option, if service provider support both and they want us to choose one, post is preferred. We usually don't have to deal with this, but some service provider would have the screen that will give you a radio button that let an admin choose which binding they want to use. In that case, we choose post. Artifact and any other bindings are not supported. That's writing notes. Okay, so far so good. So now let's go back to diagram again. We have some new names here that we have introduced. So for every service provider, there's a SP entity ID, which is the same as saying SP issuer and audience, okay? And a service provider has a ACS URL that specifies where the SAML response with the relay state, if used, is sent back to. And for IDPs, same thing. IDP is an entity ID. Well, technically speaking, every SAML application could have its own entity ID, right? If you guys have seen the issuer input field or even the set issuer in advanced script, that's what it means. And then, yeah. And each SAML application has its own IDP single sign-on URL. Remember the app key that I told you? That app key is actually pointing to that specific SAML application. So we'll give service provider that so they can send the SAML request too. Okay. All right. Certificate. On our screen, it's you will see the link download signing certificate, right? So now every Centrify cloud by default generates its own signing certificate. And on the screen, you will see that this certificate will have a different name, and they are different by using a different customer ID, tenant ID, right? So most of our customers, from observation, they simply use the default one. Only a very few number of them, and usually they are like big corporation that they have the internal policy to use their own, and more so third-party trusted certificate that they have to buy from, right, a certificate authority. So if they don't care about that, they could just use the default cert, and that is the IDP signing certificate. If they want to use their own, okay, they can set it. If you scroll to the bottom under additional options, they can upload their own cert, and then they will have to enter the private key, and then that will become the signing certificates of that one SAML application. Okay. And then after they set their own cert, when they click on download signing certificate, that link will generate the public key certificate of their certificate, right? I mean, when they upload it, they enter the private key. But the public key part can then be generated by clicking on the download signing certificate link. Yeah. So to set up, say, a single sign-on signing certificate is one of the required things that IDP has to send to SP. Authentication criteria. Okay, so we have talked about the other pieces that we need to exchange. What about inside the message? You know, remember that message is so long, there's many details and, you know, little pieces. SP could require a specific format. For example, some SAML applications require name format to be email address. Then in the transcript, we have to set that. For the syntax, we'll get to that later on. And there's other formats called such as persistence and transients. These two are only a fair few number of them used. But when they do use it, SP is supposed to specify to us that we are looking for these formats, and we will set it accordingly. Now, of course, upfront, sometimes these information are not like immediately given to us. So we'll have to ask SP that, hey, what name ID you are looking for. And for the name ID value itself, you know, some applications, when it comes to username, right? Some applications use email address as the username. But some applications manage username and email address differently. And you will use it in username, but not, right? So when it comes to single sign-on, what value is supposed to be in the name ID? Is it email address value or anything else? Because, you know, in our SAML configuration, if you remember the user account mapping screen, that is where we choose which value is coming, where this value is coming from. Usually it comes out from an AD attribute. So it could be male or the SAM account name, user principal name. In Sunsource case, they have a custom AD attribute. So, right, we need to know what name ID SP is looking for, and therefore we can, right? We also need to learn about customer's AD setup in order to know what proper value is supposed to come out from.
I think that's our number one challenge. This whole section here is them determining what they select for our sample. I think tell us what the name ID is going to be. And I think I've gotten where they expect us to already know that, especially pushing them to go to the service provider to say, well, what format, right?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to the attributes. They don't know what the full requirements are first before contacting us, and then we've got to kind of figure it out with in a way. So I think this is probably the most trouble with configuration.
And this comes later too, after the exchanging information, and single sign-on has actually been set up. But what value to use, right? That's another thing. You and I have done that with Terry Foy, right? Yeah. I think with you too.
Yeah, with First Advantage.
We've got a few of them.
Now, from development perspective, what we have done is we try to learn. We ask the service provider, you know, when they actually use it with, you know, their customers, do they usually use like email address as a username or email address as their username, right? But when there are still these cases that, you know, ultimately depends on the customer setup, right? Their AD setup, we have no way to know up front. So when we implement the template in that AD attribute field, we leave the one that service provider said, like most people would use it that way. But then, well, eventually, once again, depends on customer setup. So if their value actually came up from SAM account name instead of user principal name, we could only figure that out while knowing their AD setup. Okay, additional SAML attributes. So these are also defined by service provider if they want any SAML attributes to be used. If they do, then we will in advanced script set them. But for the SAML attribute names, the actual name, they must be provided by the service provider. And I never mess with names, so I would keep them case sensitive. Now, some service provider will have the admin screen, so the admin can define these attributes. And once again, the bottom line here is as long as they match. So whatever the admin has set in the service provider screen, then the advanced group will match the names. Okay, a lot of information so far. You guys still with me?
Oh, yeah, it's perfect.
Yep.
And mine is.
Okay, good. So here's a little summary of what pieces that needs to be exchanged. From IDP to SP side, the minimum is the issuer, like who we are, the signing certificate by clicking on the download signing certificate. And if this service provider supports SP initiated single sign-on, then we also need to give them the IDP single sign-on URL so that they can redirect the user to. Now, from the SP side, SP is supposed to send IDP their entity ID, which is also known as audience, ACS URL, so that like we know where to redirect the user to. Expected name ID value and format. If there's any SAML attributes used, then tell us what they are, and whether or not they support SP initiated single sign-on or not. Now, this is actually important because for service provider that does not support IDP initiated single sign-on, that could happen. Then if we show this SAML application in user portal, clicking that will always fail because, well, they don't support it.
Yeah.
Then in that case, for a better user experience, we have implemented a checkbox in the additional options that says show in apps list. So that's what it's for. For SAML applications that does not support IDP initiated single sign-on, we don't want to show this tile in the user portal. That we don't show it. Right. And of course, if they do not support SP initiated single sign-on, then you can expect, during the workflow is cut in half now, right? And there's no SAML request in play. So in network trace, you will see like less traffic, and that's why. Okay, now let's talk about metadata. I've used that term before because I know some of you have dealt with that before. So I've talked about all these pieces, right? Is there a simpler way for information to be exchanged between IDP and SP? The answer is yes, and that is SAML metadata XML. So it is an XML file that contains all the pieces that I've told you guys about in one single XML file. IDP will have its own, SP can have its own. Now, this is totally optional. Service provider may not have implemented this feature. But yes, 5 minutes left. Already? Okay. Okay, so this is what the IDP metadata XML look like. So once again, I'll hope you guys can see this on screen. I'm highlighting the important piece in red. So for IDP entity ID, it is given up here. Where for the signing certificate is included here. It has another name called X509 certificate.
That's the public key.
Yes, and this single sign-on service, that is and I talk about, right, we want to use post, right? So you will see metadata has multiple single sign-on service, but will have a different binding. So here's an example for SP metadata. Once again, the names are the same, entity ID, so this is the audience value. The ACAS URL with the binding post, and the URL is given in the location attribute, which means in this example, it is this one. Okay, I've been talking about generic SAML app template, so this is it. I think most of you guys have seen it or even used it. It is in App Catalog. By going to Apps, App Catalog, Add Web Apps, Custom, then SAML, and then click on Add. So you get this. So here is the ACS URL input field. that the customer is supposed to enter the ACES URL given by SP. Issuer value by default, it has generic SAML at the end. So once again, please change it to a more unique one. And then for the audience value, it has to be set inside advanced script. So here's just a list of things that we could set in application settings. I've already talked about ACES URL and issuer. Here's some read-only field. These are generated by Centrify Cloud. And every SAML application will have different value because the app key is different. So these are the IDP sign-in URL, and if service providers support error URL as well as sign-out URL, these are the URLs that we will give, or Centrify will give to the service provider. Here's also, you'll see the link download IDP SAML metadata, just so that for service provider who don't want separate pieces to send out, they want one metadata file, this link is where you click on. Some service provider want the metadata at a URL. They don't want a file. Okay, we have a metadata URL that you could get the same metadata from that URL. In fact, if you go to that URL, it will download the same file. And then additional settings, which is further down the screen. It's not shown. They show in user app list that we just talked about. We use it if that SAML application does not support IDP initiated single sign-on. And a certificate, if the customer wants to use their own, that's where they can set it. Advanced, like I told you, we will use there's a set audience method to set the SP and the TID. And then there's a test button above the input field so we can get a preview of the SAML response, right? And other things like name ID format, SAML attributes, and relay state, if you want to set it, it's also in the advanced tab. Okay. I do have more slides about the advanced scripts, but it is at the end of this slide deck. So we have time at the end, we'll go through those.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the end of the first section.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just a long lecture about all these pieces and technical terms. So at least I hope what you guys take out from this one is just that workflow, how SP and IDP talk to each other,
Yeah.
what